Silly humor, cabbages, goofy trolls, and an island with a society of monkeys. This is the lighthearted slice of Runescape, the part of the game that has an innocent charm that would make you say, "Ah yes, my childhood," right after you remember the time that you got scammed and cried. But Runescape was made by a lot of different people, and some of these people didn't design their content with children in mind. And you couldn't blame them because text-based adventure games of the late 20th century that RuneScape evolved from were not played by children primarily. And so we get some interesting content that stands out even more when you compare it to the vast majority of innocent and just general silliness that RuneScape is aligned with. These are 5 times that RuneScape was definitely not a children's game. The Queen of Varrock has a lovely garden thanks to your efforts in the Garden of Tranquility quest, but the things that we had to do to get the seeds to plant these lovely floral specimens might have left some blood on our hands. And no, I'm not talking about the cutscene where the Guard of Falador ponder their short lives before being slaughtered by PK Master 0036. No, the real tragedy of this quest would have been completely missed if you didn't closely read some of the dialogue regarding 2 of the farmers you were trying to obtain seeds from. You see, Elstan, the farmer south of Falador, will only give you the delphinium seeds you request if you grow some marigolds for him to give to a lady he fancies. It turns out this lady is Lyra, another farmer who resides at the dismal farming patch in Mauritania. This is where things get, well, dark. Lyra also has some of the seeds we need, and through using the powers of the Ring of Karos, a very persuasive ring, Lyra admits to us a rather dark secret in her life. She admits that in order to survive in Mauritania and avoid the vampire's blood tax, she seduces men from the western kingdoms and brings them to her house where vampires ambush the poor romantics, and they're never seen again. This is already tragic enough, but Elstan, the farmer from Falador, is going to visit Lyra with the marigolds we gave to him. Elstan is about to become vampire food, and it's all so we could get some seeds. Elstan is lucky that old school RuneScape is frozen in time, or else, as soon as he leaves his post at the farming patch, he's about to have the worst day of his life, which really sucks considering he seems to have really fallen in love with Lyra. It's a tragic tale, or perhaps just a horror story in the making, but I love how the quest doesn't ever really draw our attention to the connection between these 2 characters. They leave it up to us to make the horrific connection, and honestly, you could design a whole quest around the story of Lyra and Elstan. Perhaps we could even save our doomed farmer, or perhaps not. Next, we go to a place that I've spoken about on my channel before. It shouldn't come as a surprise that the things that go on in the pass under the Andar Mountains aren't exactly PG in nature. I won't harp on about this too much, as I have 2 videos dedicated to this mysterious and bizarre location. Today, I just want to hone in on the Soulless. The process of how someone becomes one of these creatures is shown to you as you travel through the pass, and their story is one of the least pleasant things I can think of in this game. Travelers exploring the pass get lost in the labyrinthine tunnels and eventually begin to hear whispers. These whispers cause you to slowly lose your mind, where you are broken down psychologically and then forced to do potentially violent acts. Finally, once you have committed unspeakable atrocities, you are put in a cage. The cage is too small to stand up in and is situated on isolated columns of rock which peer into the abyss. There's a painting by a Polish artist, Zdzisław Beksinski, which is about the closest thing that represents the plight of these poor, half-soulless beings. The ominous isolation. The image shows a world that has long since ended. And yet, Jagex has somehow found a way to make it seem even worse. These former humans have endured a terrible journey of both psychological and physical torture, and the reward for surviving is to become nothing more than pale monsters that wander aimlessly around the depths of the underground pass, stripped of not just their humanity, but also their polygons too. Very tragic. The Soulless remind me of the monsters from the movie The Descent, which is also about people getting lost in a cave, and what the deep and dark places of the world can do to your mind. Very much the cinematic equivalent of doing the underground pass with a low agility level. Let's leave the cursed underground pass once again, hopefully for a while, and move on to something that I really didn't catch until I was completing the Dorgeshan questline again on my Iron Man. And this one actually was quite surprising to me. It's the death of Zanuck in Death to the Dorgeshan. When you and Zanuck infiltrate the Ham base of operations, you are able to overhear some of the plans of Sigmund, the Ham leader, but right after you and Zanuck are discovered. As you are captured, you are knocked unconscious, so you are unable to see what happens to Zanuck. The brutal truth is revealed to us after we escape the Ham hideout to find Zanuck's dead body. When we discover the mark on her forehead glowing, we take her to the snake Juna, and she reveals that she has a destiny, and through some power that we don't understand at this point in the story, she's resurrected. Goblin Jesus. I am not here to talk about the overall story of the quest though, just a detail. When Zanuck comes back to life, she begins screaming, seemingly reliving the last few moments before she died, and let me tell you, it wasn't very pleasant. Zanuck screams, quote, "Get off of me, end quote. She even calls out to you specifically and pleads for your help before screaming no. The game makes a point to give you an idea of how Zanuck was killed, but it leaves it up to your imagination for the specifics. But it's safe to say that she was probably brutally murdered by the Ham members, and it's one of the only times in the game that it really tries to make you take notice of a character's death. They really make a point to show that you as the player were not able to help this character, and weren't able to save the day like you had so many times before. Other beloved characters have died in RuneScape, but this is the only one that really starts to feel a bit too realistic for our fantasy world expectations. Although her death was brutal, it did raise the stakes, and allowed us to care for Zanuck as a character. The final quest in the Dorgeshan series, the Chosen Commander, could be argued to be one of the best quests in RuneScape from a pure storytelling perspective. But that is a story for another time. Now we head back to the dismal grey land of Mauritania to investigate a place I am sure all of you know. Fenkenstrain's castle. It wasn't always his castle though. The castle used to belong to Karos, the only human advisor to Lawerniel Draken, the vampire ruler of Mauritania. Karos lost his life when he attempted to use the magical power of his Ring of Persuasion on Draken himself. Later, a family of settlers from the Kingdom of Mislan found and inhabited the old castle, and even managed to find Karos' ring, which they passed down as a family heirloom for many generations. The lineage of this family was brutally ended when a doctor by the name of Fenkenstrain was attempting to escape from a group of werewolves from the village of Canifis. Fenkenstrain, somehow knowing about the ring of Karos, and that it was possessed by the family that resided in Karos' old castle, managed to steal the ring from the current lord of the castle, Rologarth. Rologarth later caught Fenkenstrain and demanded he give up the ring, but Fenkenstrain had alerted the vampires of a human family that now dubbed themselves the Lords of the North Coast. The vampires would not stand for humans giving themselves lands and titles on Sanguinesti land, and proceeded to murder Rologarth's entire family, to be made an example of. All the while, Fenkenstrain was able to avoid trouble due to now being in possession of the Ring of Karos. He claimed the castle as his own after the vampires had murdered everyone else, and used the ring as a way to persuade the vampires who hunted him to leave him alone. This is when we come into the picture after hearing about a job on offer at the old castle up the road from Canifis. Fenkenstrain wants us to do a bit of hard labor in the form of grave digging. So we set out to dig up the graves of what is presumably the family Fenkenstrain had killed. It gets more messed up when we discover that Fenkenstrain hadn't been idle with his time in Karos' old castle. He had been doing experiments. Horrifying surgical experiments that would make you thankful that RuneScape wasn't made in the new Unreal Engine, otherwise you'd have nightmares for days. Humans that had their heads attached to the bodies of spiders. Werewolves that had their heads attached to the bodies of sheep, probably as a cruel joke and a bit of revenge on Fenkenstrain's part, and finally a poor girl whose head was attached to a horse. After mercy killing these experiments, you continue onwards to a small island to dig up more body parts. The cherry on top of this completely cursed plot is that when you complete Fenkenstrain's task of sewing the dismembered body parts together, and then animating poor old Rologarth back to life, is that he is brought back into the world with the sewed together body parts of his murdered family members. I mentioned this quest was completely fucked up, right? When Frankenstein realizes that the life you helped him reanimate was actually the guy he had murdered previously, it actually puts into perspective his reaction when he demands that you destroy his creation. I mean, I don't really blame him. How could he have known that the brain of the guy he had murdered was the brain sitting on the countertop of the bar in Canifus, and that we would purchase this exact brain to use in the reanimation? Finally, let's talk about what goes on in Darkmeyer. I've made a whole video previously about how I think vampires from the Runescape universe are scarier than any other vampire from literary or modern culture. The vampire's desire to taste the emotion of hope in the blood of their prey makes them do some terrifying things, even so far as to let their meals go free for a time before recapturing them later for the kill. That being said, Darkmeyer doesn't really feel like a hopeful place. Humans serve as the vampire's choice beverage on tap while being chained to the walls in their homes. Humans being auctioned off in what might look like a slave market, but it's really more of a meat market. Then there's this lovely meat wagon. The RuneScape 3 Darkmeyer has cleaned up their alleyways a bit better than this. Out of all of this, there is one moment that I remember as more unfortunate than the rest. It goes back to the end of one of the Myerky quests, when the human Gataranx has to face off against you after you get in the way of his tax collection. Gataranx dies at our hand, but tells us that he only ever did what he did because the vampires held his family captive and used that as leverage to compel him to carry out his unfortunate job. He makes us promise that we will try to save his family before he dies. And in the future, we do run across Gataranx's family, Maria and Ron Gataranx. The Gataranx family has been sold off from their original caretakers after you killed the head of the family, and now the family couldn't be used as leverage anymore. It's an unfortunate situation because although captivity is not ideal for humans in Darkmeyer, it matters a great deal who you are held captive by. It turns out that the Gataranx family was owned by a vampire named Lord Alexei Jovkai, who very much enjoyed the taste of hope, and due to his palate, he took rather good care of his property. But now the family was being sold off to a much less caring individual named Desmodus. But Lord Alexei apparently did care quite a bit about his property, and stole the family back from Desmodus. There is only one problem. Desmodus guards the entrance to the Arboretum where the Blisterwood tree resides, and we need access to the Blisterwood tree if we are to succeed against Vanstrom Klaus. And so you, the player, have to embark on the single most degrading and cruel task in the history of RuneScape. You have to go and reclaim the poor family under the guise of a vampire noble and ensure that they are handed over to their new owner, the cruel Desmodus, much to the protest of the family, who plead with you that they much prefer being with Lord Alexei. You ignore their pleas and hand them over to what is likely a fate worse than death, all so you can access the Blisterwood tree. The Gataranx family was sacrificed for the greater good, you could argue. The Blisterwood weapons allow you to strike at the heart of the vampire leadership, and eventually it all leads up to you taking on Lorniel Draken himself. But for the time being, you are left to stew in a promise you defiled. For instead of saving or even trying to help the wife and child of a man you killed who pleaded with you to save his family in his dying words, you condemned them instead. I hope you enjoyed that rather grim video. Please like the video if you liked it, and if you didn't, downvote the shit out of it. If you're curious about some of the more in-depth content I've done on some of these topics, I will link them down below. Write a comment about what you think the least family-friendly moment in RuneScape is. I am sure there's probably enough for a part 2. Anyways, farewell for now.